Greetings and thank you for your interest in this module from the Knowledge Management Training Package on the topic of documenting program experiences. This presentation is based on experience from the Knowledge Success Project as well as previous knowledge management projects. Along with our partners, we have experience documenting and sharing lessons learned over many years and using a variety of formats. This presentation will share some of our tips and lessons learned based on that experience. Our learning objectives for this session are to understand why documentation is important, to realize the importance of defining your audience and understanding their needs, including learning styles, to review different content formats, and to discuss a case study of documenting program experiences using different formats. Now, why should we document program experiences? Documentation is important because it allows us to use knowledge to inform and improve programs. It also contributes to the evidence base around what works and what does not work. It prevents us from reinventing the wheel, and it helps us convert tacit knowledge to explicit knowledge. You may remember the terms tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge from other modules in the Knowledge Management Training Package. But to quickly review, tacit knowledge is information that is in people's heads, such as their experiences and know-how. Explicit knowledge is in a format that can be stored and shared with others, such as in databases, reports, or publications. Explicit knowledge is more visible, but once we document our effective practices, that explicit knowledge becomes tacit. Now, here are the main steps in documenting program experiences. First, you want to identify your story. That is, why is this a unique story to tell? Or why is the topic important? Second, you will then determine your audience. That is, who will be reading your story? Or what do they want to know? Third, you'll then select your format. That is, how does your audience prefer to engage with this information? Then you will collect the information, and finally, in the fifth step, you will create your call to action. In other words, what do you want your audience to do after they engage with your content? Now, in the first step, you will identify your story. What topic or story do you want to document? What is unique about this experience? And why is this topic important? And why will this information be interesting or helpful to others? Next, you need to define and understand your audience. Defining your audience, essentially the people who will be interacting with your content, is one of the most important steps because everything else flows from this. The audience you're creating for determines the focus of your content piece, what tone to use, and the most appropriate formats and channels for documenting and disseminating the content. Some key things that you'll want to know are: first, who are you trying to reach with your content? For example, many of you may work in social and behavior change or SBC, and the end user of family planning may be your primary audience for your SBC messages. But if you're documenting your SBC program as a whole for others to learn from, it's likely that program managers and technical advisors will be your audience. And as you can imagine, they are likely to prefer to receive information in different ways than, say, a woman seeking family planning services. Next, what type of information does your audience want and need? What will draw them to your content piece and make them want to read it? And then finally, what is their preferred learning style? We'll talk more about this on the next slide. As I mentioned, it's very important to understand the preferred learning style of your audience. Some people like to see information, some like to hear information, and some like to read information. These learning styles affect how people internalize, understand, and act on the information that they receive. Knowing this information will help you determine which format you will use to document and share your effective practices. 7 common learning styles are listed here in front of you. First, visual learners have a preference for images, pictures, diagrams, and charts. Second, oral learners prefer information that is heard or spoken, such as lectures, podcasts, etc. Third, verbal learners have a preference for information displayed as words and texts. Fourth, physical learners have a preference for learning information by doing, so they prefer hands-on learning opportunities. Fifth, logical learners. They prefer using logic, reasoning, and systems. Sixth, social learners like learning in groups or with other people. And finally, seventh, that is solitary learners who prefer working and learning alone through self-study. Keep in mind that while most people have a primary learning style, individuals also often have secondary learning styles and or a combination of learning styles that they prefer. For example, someone may prefer social learning but specifically oral. In other words, they may learn best through in-person presentations. Next, you will select your format. Because the learning style varies for each audience, it is important to know what format your audience prefers. And if your audience is diverse, it is a good idea to create content in a range of formats. If you are going to be routinely documenting effective practices for an external audience, our recommendation is to vary the format from time to time to address multiple learning styles. So from time to time, document something verbally through a webinar or through a written case study or a short video. Each individual has different preferences as far as how they consume information. The medium you use to tell your story will depend on a number of factors like time, place, connectivity, context, and audience preferences. Your messages and stories can be in-depth and long, or they can be very short. Some of these would be more appropriate for policymakers and others for your audience. Next, you will collect the information. When formally documenting effective practices, it's very important to cover the following points. Background and context. This can include the country, region, setting, community, etc. of the activity in addition to the type of individuals included in the activity. For example, young people, contraceptive users, etc. You may also want to include a detailed description of the intervention itself. For example, explain the intervention in clear, plain language so your audience can easily understand what you did. Next, include details about the implementation, how long was the program, what were the steps involved, what stakeholders were involved, and what was the process. You also will want to include the impact of the activity. What were the results of the program? Be specific and include relevant data. For example, out of 5 clinics in the program, 4 successfully integrated family planning into HIV services. As a result, more than 4,000 new clients were reached with contraceptive services. Challenges you encountered along the way. What were the key barriers and challenges? How were they overcome? And finally, summarize your lessons learned. This is a nice way to wrap up your story with lessons and recommendations for future programs. Including this information will help your audience learn from your experiences and hopefully use your experiences to inform their own work. Collecting the information is an important step too. Documentation can be done throughout a program or at the end of an activity or program. If you are documenting your own work, it is best to document it throughout so you are not scrambling to get all of the information at the end. Here are some examples for how you could integrate documentation efforts into your routine work. You could conduct interviews or surveys throughout the activity to collect feedback on what's working, what's not, how things are going, recommendations, quantitative data, etc. You could include documentation in your standard reporting templates as well. That could include requiring that quotes and images be included in project reports that you could refer back to later. Finally, every great content piece ends with a call to action. What do you want the audience to do? Is it a specific data point, more information about a specific population, whatever it may be? What do you want them to feel? Do you want them to feel empowered, knowledgeable, sentimental? And what do you want them to do? Do you want them to integrate your lessons learned into their work, etc.? Here are some tips for creating a call to action. Think of the action verbs you want to use, like engage, use, implement. Use words and or photos to grab their attention and provoke emotion or enthusiasm. And give your audience a reason why they should take action. In other words, what will be the outcome if they take that action? On the screen, you'll see a sample of a call to action from a Knowledge Success blog post documenting the importance of vasectomy in family planning programs. You'll see that the call to action starts by summarizing the importance of including vasectomy and then talk about the opportunity for all involved in family planning decisions to include vasectomy on the agenda. We're going to share an example now of implementation stories that Knowledge Success developed with the World Health Organization's IBP network and how the two groups shared these stories in a variety of formats. Knowledge Success and the IBP network identified a set of 15 stories and disseminated them in a variety of formats for different learning styles. The purpose of the stories was to share how programs incorporated high-impact practices and WHO guidelines into their family planning programs. They wanted to find a way for program teams to share practical advice with others looking to use these same approaches, and we wanted to share real-life challenges and potential solutions. We have included a link to the implementation stories at the end of this presentation. Here are some examples of the written stories. Knowledge Success released a call for implementation stories in 2020, received over 100 applications and selected 15. You'll see 3 of those here. These written stories included background and specifics on how they implemented these HIPs and WHO guidelines and were each 6 pages in length. To create these stories, they developed a template and worked with authors from each organization. Authors conducted interviews, gathered photos, and developed a first draft. Knowledge Success and IBP then provided feedback and finalized the stories with the authors. And they worked to copy edit, layout, and also translate the stories to publish them each in English, Spanish, and French. Here are a few tips that helped as they created this written collection of stories. First, because they wanted this information to be useful to others, they asked authors to be as specific as possible about what worked and what didn't work. They didn't just want these programs to be success stories, but to also include challenges as well as recommendations for similar programs. Among the authors, and also when people were conducting interviews for their stories, the Knowledge Success team encouraged them to create a trusting environment so that people would feel comfortable opening up about what their challenges were and how they overcame them. To create this trusting environment, one of the things they did was ask questions about a range of topics and to talk in a more casual setting. It often helps people feel more comfortable sharing if they feel like they are not being judged or put on a spot, if it's more of a conversation and they know what to expect. They also encouraged authors to add photos to give the readers a visual sense of the project. And they asked them to weave in personal touches like quotes and anecdotes. Authors also included data to set the context, but they didn't want the stories to be too data heavy. They wanted them to show programming in real-world scenarios. The knowledge success team also created a template which included suggested headings to help break up the text so it would be more digestible for the readers. Because Knowledge Success wanted to appeal to a range of different learning styles, they also launched the stories with a series of webinars. They held one global webinar, 4 regional webinars, and one specific to India. These webinars allowed the authors to present their stories in a bit more depth, to dialogue with other authors in the region, and to answer questions from the audience. It also was a good opportunity to promote the written stories and offer some supplemental or complementary information. The webinar recordings are available on the HIP's website, which is linked at the end of this presentation. Here are some suggestions for webinars that highlight program experiences. It is important to feature a range of speakers so that the audience does not tire of one person speaking the whole time. Plan in advance. The better prepared the team is, the smoother the webinar will be. Ask someone to moderate the webinar, who can encourage discussion and solicit questions from the audience. If you are using slides, try to make them highly visual. Think of using photos, maps, infographics, and other engaging visual content. Limit the amount of text on the slides whenever possible. Be sure to leave time for discussion so the audience will feel engaged. You can also use poll questions and use the chat to encourage the audience to ask questions and connect with each other and with the speakers. Another example of how you could document effective practices is through a podcast or audio interviews. After the webinar series, Knowledge Success wanted to continue promoting these rich stories, so they decided to devote a season of their podcast to the stories. We had 6 episodes and each one featured 2 to 3 of the implementation story authors. The Knowledge Success and the IBP team interviewed the authors of each of the 15 stories and compiled the stories by theme, whether it was youth or integration or innovation. They then crafted 6 podcast episodes and published transcripts of each episode in English, Spanish, and French on our website, although the audio episode was only publishing in English. We have included a link to the Inside the FP story at the end of this presentation. Here are some suggestions for questions that get to the heart of what we want to know and help us draw out and document lessons learned. This is the information that can best help others as they incorporate this in their own programs. Here is one of the stories from partners in India who documented their use of a fixed-day static approach. The written story is on the left and the podcast episode featuring the story is on the right. Same content but different formats to accommodate different types of audience, those who preferred reading and those who prefer listening. This is a nice example of how similar content can be published in multiple formats and cover different aspects. The written tends to include more data and background, and the audio podcast includes more personal perspectives and experiences. The same authors were interviewed for the written and the audio version. And what they found is that the podcast was not exactly the same information, just like the webinar, but offered a bit more of a casual take, including additional nuance and anecdotes. We have included here a clip from the podcast so you can get a sense of what the audio content was like. In this clip, we have Deepthi Mathur, one of the authors of this story, talking about what she thought others could learn from her story. To sum up this module, documenting experiences can help us implement stronger programs, and they can inform the programs of others as well. It is important to clearly define your audience and determine what format or formats they prefer before publishing your content. Remember to use a range of different formats to appeal to different learning styles and preferences. Documenting experiences throughout a program and incorporating documentation into your everyday work can greatly help reduce the burden of documentation. And finally, Remember to include a call to action when you document your story. This can help readers understand the key point of your documentation and act upon the results. Here are some resources and links from this presentation that you will find very helpful. Thank you.